Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Ipser Colloquium series. It is my honor to present our colleagues, Drew Jacoby-Senghor and Derek Brown. They're going to present some of their work today. Derek is first author on this work, and Drew is going to primarily present it, but we're blessed to have them as a panel, kind of a two-for-one package. And so as you ask your questions, if you have clarifying questions, please feel free to ask them. I'm actually going to moderate today since Derek is kind of playing the role of panelist along with Drew. I will elevate you to speaker and you can ask your question, or if you want to note in the comments, Dana, can you please just ask this question? It's a quick clarifying question. And then of course at the end, we can have a deeper discussion. So let me start by introducing Drew. So Drew, he grew up in Santa Rosa, the wine country, and he then went to Stanford, followed by Princeton, and then had a two-year postdoc at Columbia Business School. And then we went out and roped him into coming back into the Bay Area. And so we're so happy to have him back home. He's squarely a social psychologist, a social personality psychologist, but he is really influenced by theories from sociology to behavioral economics to, kind of policy work, to law, to education, and he's got publications in all of these different domains. He's, totally methodologically agnostic. You'll see him doing intervention work. You'll see him doing personality work. The work he's been doing lately has a lot of implication for policy, and so you'll see some of that work today. And that's work that he's been doing in conjunction with Derek. So Derek is one of our star graduate students over at the Haas School of Business, and he, like Drew, they work on questions broadly related to, inequality, racial bias and discrimination, and anything that we can do to understand it and, I think most importantly, ameliorate it. And one final comment on Drew is that the reason, he's at a business school, even though he's a social and personality psychologist theoretically, is that he really cares about the real world. And so I think that, we drew him over to the business school thinking that that would help him kind of see all the ways in which his work would be applicable to the real world. The truth is that all of us care about the real world. And so, unlike maybe 30 years ago, a psychology department today is sort of, from my perspective, indistinguishable from, those of us at a business school that are social psychologists. So I will stop talking. I am the moderator today, so please ask questions. And if you want to direct them to either Derek or Drew, specify that. And also maybe clarify if you would like me to interrupt them and ask them a question midstream, or if you want to defer that until the end. And without further ado, I would like to turn it over to one of my most favorite colleagues in the entire world, Drew Jacoby-Senghor, and one of my most favorite graduate students in the world, Derek Brown.
Thanks, Dana. Glad to be.
Notice my effervescence coupled with his thanks, Dana. Sorry, this is just classic. Sorry, I'll turn myself off now. Okay.
Thank you, Dana. This is fantastic to be sharing the research that we're doing up at the business school with like-minded colleagues in the psych department. Like Dana said, this is work that I have done with Derek. He's the first author on this paper. Follow-up work on this project. It has also been done in conjunction with Dana's lab manager, Isaac Ramundo, who's going to be starting graduate school this next year. Both of them are fantastic researchers in their own right. So we started this project, Derek and I, with this really basic question of why aren't we more successful at increasing diversity in the institutions where we care about it, right? I was struck also by this Pew Research. I didn't expect it to be quite this striking, that most people actually see things like affirmative action as a good thing, and that's actually been increasing over the past 2 decades. And despite this, we see things like affirmative action being struck down in Washington, despite it being a very liberal state. That was in 2019. And obviously for anyone who's voting in California this past election cycle, they're aware that we struck down Prop 16, which would have made affirmative action once again legal in the state. And this, despite historic turnout and despite overwhelming numbers of people voting in liberal ways in other places on the ballot. So this is not just in state policy. We also see this, in Silicon Valley, right down the street from us, where as little as 6 years ago, tech firms were grappling with this question of how do we increase diversity. And one of the first steps they took was a kind of mea culpa of sorts, admitting we're not really that good at diversity. We're going to publish our numbers and show you just how bad at diversity we actually are, show how few women and people of color we have in our companies, with the goal of ultimately increasing those numbers over the years and then being able to show that progress and report that progress. Despite that initial effort and this transparency, this is the level of representational inequality in Silicon Valley has pretty much remained the same since they first started publishing these numbers. So if we look to research in social psychology, if we look to research in social science more broadly, to explain why we might be seeing these phenomena out in the real world, we oftentimes will see research using ideology as an explanatory factor, right? So basically, this idea that ideologies might be the reason why people do not support diversity and do not support diversity policy. Famously, social dominance orientation, this opposition to kind of equality, a preference for social hierarchy is one such ideology. We also see that concern for one's status or the status of one's group will also drive support for diversity policies, with whites or majority members more generally showing less support the more concerned they are with their group status on an ideological level. And we also see, interestingly, the kind of converse relationship where changes in diversity can subsequently change ideology as well. So Maureen Craig, Jen Richardson have a very interesting series of studies where they look at, they prime participants with changing demographics in the United States. And they show that when they tell white participants in their studies that by, I think, 2042 or so, it's expected that white Americans will no longer be the majority in the United States, that you see increases in things like conservatism and group status threat. You can also see other studies where it will shift opposition to diversity. Similar priming of diversity will also lead participants, white participants, to identify more strongly with their racial group. In terms of where we see most of this research on diversity policy beliefs, policy perceptions, it's usually in zero-sum context, and this becomes vitally important in a number of ways. As some examples of how we see it operationalized, there are things like hiring decisions that are inherently zero-sum, right? So you have 3 candidates, and you have to select one of those 3 candidates for the position. You could also see it in some research where they prime participants to think about zero-sum contexts, or it's theorized, the effects are theorized to apply specifically to zero-sum contexts. As Brian Lowry at Stanford did in some of his seminal work on affirmative action beliefs. And then, as I mentioned, this is a graph, a piece of stimulus from Maureen Craig and Jen Richardson, where they kind of frame shifting demographics as an inherently zero-sum proposition, right? At some point, white Americans are going to become, go from the majority group to the minority group, and therefore lose status. So if we take this research together, what it might suggest to us is that if we can just change hearts and minds, right, get people to be more ideologically supportive of diversity, or if we can create policies that are in effect win-win, right, that are not zero-sum, that benefit all groups involved, we might be able to solve this diversity problem. We might be able to get more people implementing effective diversity initiatives. But as as we might expect from the examples I gave with voting in Silicon Valley early on, this doesn't necessarily seem to be the case, right? These don't seem to be leading to the types of solutions that we would hope for. And so what this led Derek and I to ask was, might it be that group membership itself is part of the problem here, right? And in particular, we know from very seminal work on the social identity perspective, on the basic idea of what groups do to our minds and how they shape perception, that at a very basic level, above and beyond the effects of ideology, the group that we belong to, the group that we identify with, that will shape how we see the world. And particularly important is that it's not just whether or not we have that we've aligned ourselves with an in-group and we see other groups as an out-group, but where our group is in the social hierarchy is fundamentally important, and that also shapes our perceptions of the world. And in particular, it shapes a focus and a preoccupation with a maintenance of our group's current status. So for a high status group, for a majority group, a concern with having that status undercut. We also know that zero-sum thinking is pervasive, even when it doesn't necessarily need to be applied to a particular situation. There's classic work on relative deprivation and social comparison, but we see kind of this application of zero-sum thinking in a lot of different contexts. Like negotiations. I teach negotiations. I spend weeks. Derek actually has TA'd with me for negotiations. We spend a long time trying to convince people that a negotiation is not just a tug of war over resources, right? It's not just a zero-sum proposition, that you can actually grow the pie and make all parties better off through negotiation. We also see this in zero-sum thinking in everyday transactions, where if I go to the grocery store and I grab a bag of grapefruit and I pay for those grapefruit at the cashier, when you ask participants, is there a winner or a loser in this scenario, more than you'd expect, participants actually will say yes, one side won and one side lost, even though this is a very basic transaction. We also see it, and this might hit a little too close to home for some of us instructors, maybe even more so for some TAs. In classes where there is not a grading curve, so where you might, it's hypothetically possible for all students to get an A if they do, good enough job in the class. Students still look at that class as if it were curved. So specifically, when another student receives an A, they see themselves as being less likely to receive an A, even when that's not the case. So what this leads us to hypothesize is that it might be the case that majority group members perceive diversity policies as unbeneficial to their in-group, and even when these policies actually benefit them, right? And this last clause on this slide here is kind of what we'll be referring to roughly when we talk about non-zero-sum policies throughout the talk. This idea that a policy not only benefits the minority group, but also benefits majority members. Okay, so for the studies that I'm going to be sharing today, we're going to have 5. The first we just try to explore in kind of a naturalistic way, in the most, with the most verisimilitude that we could get. Do majority members misperceive how diversity policies affect the in-group? And then we started asking what these perceptions might be driven by. In particular, how it's framed, right? Whether or not it has a diversity framing or some kind of other framing, or is it about to whom the benefits are expected to be conferred? And then as we get into this idea of benefits, is it more important to participants, or do they attend more closely to being better off in an overall sense? So did this policy make me or my group better off? Or are they more focused on whether or not they're better off than the outgroup? And then finally, we try to delve specifically into group membership and see whether or not this drives our effects. Any questions before I start doing our designs? Okay.
Art raised his hand. Yeah, Art.
Oh, yeah.
I elevated you to, let me see.
Okay.
There you are. Yeah, go ahead. Ask your question, Art.
So you say majority group members.
Yeah.
Does this apply to majorities when they are disadvantaged? Like in many contexts, women are the majority, or in South Africa, blacks are the majority, but they're disadvantaged.
Yeah.
So is it they're being advantaged, or is it being majority that's the issue?
That's a great, so we don't yet have direct evidence to speak to this, but kind of in our internal conversations, we're theorizing that it has more to do with advantage rather than and kind of group status rather than like just a pure majority, right? So in the studies I'll be talking about today, that's roughly conflated, right? Majority group membership and advantage, but that's spot on.
Yeah, that's the case in most countries.
Yeah, exactly.
Although it's not the case in all situations if you look at other kinds of groups besides ethnicity.
Exactly. Yeah, I know. So that's one of the additional kind of the open questions that we're left with after we go through all these studies is, in basic sense, generalizability, but kind of if we go to other contexts where the dynamics haven't been so well worn in the public sphere, how do people perceive them and how might things differ? But to answer your question, we do think that it has more to do with advantage than it does with, and status than it does with majority membership.
Great, thank you.
So the first study that we ran was a very simple one-cell design. And what we did was have about 200 M-Turkers, white M-Turkers, see a policy, a diversity policy, or actually a series of diversity initiatives. And we asked them, how do you expect this initiative is going to affect your racial group? And while we did that, or after they answered that question, we also asked a bunch of different ideological measures, right? Some of the classics like modern racism, SDO, all different kinds of group threat, and all the way to things like kind of their general ideological support for diversity and their political orientation. And the idea here was to see if any of these ideologies potentially explained our effect. So what we did is we showed them this very realistic looking press release from Berkeley Haas. And in this press release, we described a number of kind of diversity and inclusion efforts that were being rolled out. These are all efforts and initiatives that are pretty popular and you're likely to see at many American universities. They are also, importantly, all kind of the race neutral initiatives that you would need to see at a university or a university system like ours, which is not allowed to make race-based admissions or hiring decisions. The most crucial of these initiatives to our DV was this new admission criteria. And the details were these. We told them that we are going to admit 50 additional full-time MBA students each year. In effect, we are increasing the class size and thereby increasing the likelihood that any applicant, any one applicant has of getting into the school, right? We're increasing acceptance rates. We also tell them that this isn't based on racial identification. It's a program that will place greater consideration on the applicant's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and increase the number of students of all backgrounds. And then we ask them, how do you think this policy will affect white applicants' likelihood of getting accepted to Berkeley Haus? And what we find, despite the fact that we've told them we've increased the class size, we've increased the odds of acceptance for any one student or applicant, they believe, these white participants believe that these policies will lead to a decrease in the likelihood of acceptance for applicants from their racial group. And so we have all of these ideological measures that we collected. Do we see the same effect when we control for these ideological measures, right? Could it be the case that just we have some participants in our sample who are either high or low on some of these that are driving this, this main effect that we're seeing? And we find that, that's not the case. Even when controlling for these ideological measures, the exact same effect persists. They see these policies as likely decreasing the odds of a white applicant getting into the school. So the next study we ran was basically the same design, but we wanted to pump our brakes a little bit and consider the possibility that our response, this effect that we saw in this first study was due to the fact that our white, MTurk participants were just, they don't have any kind of relationship to the school. A lot of these people might not have gone to college or might not have been in college for a very long time. How might participants feel about these policies if they're actually students at the school, right? If they have some investment in the implementation of these policies, and if they are inundated with and perhaps even indoctrinated with the kind of value structures, the value systems inherent at Berkeley. So we collected data from actual undergrads at Berkeley Haas. We also collected data not only from white students, but also from Asian students, right? Both of these groups being considered overrepresented groups in the Berkeley University context and kind of more generally throughout a lot of the UC system. This also gets, though not directly, we're not exactly testing what Art brought up, this gets at a little bit of his question, right? The overrepresentation is a kind of advantage, but Asian Americans obviously are not majority members in, a majority of California, and white students, I think, still make up more of the undergrad population. So we asked them the same exact DV, how is this policy going to affect your racial group? And this cadre of ideological measures. And what we find is that when white students are asked, how is this going to affect white applicants' chances of getting accepted? And Asian students are asked, how is this going to affect Asian applicants' chances? Both say that this policy is going to decrease the odds of acceptance. And this pattern is significant both when you account for, once again, all of these ideological measures, and if you look at white or Asian applicant or Asian participants separately. So this is a very basic demonstration, but there's a lot of stuff going on in this set of stimuli, and there's a lot of possible things that could be driving what participants are focused on.
Drew.
Yeah.
There's a question that came in. Yeah. So Tyrone is interested. He said, I'm curious. I assume he him. This person did not specify gender identity, but I'm not 100% sure. But Tyrone indicated, I'm curious if there was any probe about why participants thought it would be detrimental to their racial group. I can imagine people thinking it's more likely that non-whites would demonstrate, quote, commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah. So Derek, I won't put Derek on the spot here. He might have a better sense of what kind of responses people generated in a free response kind of way. We did ask those kinds of questions. It's been a little while, so those are definitely not top of mind for us. But your general question of, do participants just think that certain students are more likely to kind of be plucked out as these diversity leaders, right, is exactly what we were thinking, and is actually what we were trying to address through our design and study too. So I'll explain this, and then if we have follow-up kind of concerns or questions, we can get into them.
Drew, I had a quick question too. What does -1 mean on that scale? Does that mean like I slightly think this is detrimental, or how does it go? So -1 means what?
So basically what we do is we just provide these anchors to them, right? So we say, how do you think it's going to affect your in-group? And it goes from no effect at 0 to greatly harm at -3 and greatly improve. So for them, it's just a matter of gradation. So it's like they think it's going to slightly harm their chances.
But it's not anchored specifically, but it's definitely moving towards harm, basically.
Yeah. And we've done this a number of different ways in kind of follow-up studies where we ask more like more numerical kind of versions of this, like what exactly affect, like percentage-wise or an absolute number of seats or students kind of ways. And you generally see the same kind of pattern of effects. But I think most importantly, we actually find the strongest effects and the most consistent and the clearest when we ask it this way. And I think it's for a couple of different reasons. One, people are bad at numbers, right? So when you ask them about real numbers, there's a lot more variance, and they also they're just unsure. And I think what we've come to believe is that our studies show that this is really like an initial kind of reaction, a feeling that people have, as opposed to like a hard and fast or kind of logical interpretation of the numerical likelihood of acceptance, right? And so this is, even though it's a little bit less concrete, I think it's actually a better representation of how people in our studies are feeling.
And have you guys ever thought of like having people do a quick sort of Kahneman-esque stats test to see like, are they statistically minded? Do they tend to do math when they're thinking about this? Because this is such a blind spot, right? Like obviously it increases everyone's chances. So like it would stand to reason that if you were a math type that you might do the proper calculation.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. We have started to do, we don't have anything conclusive in this way yet. And in follow-up work, we've started to ask people to focus on different components of the information that we provide them, like in very kind of ham-fisted ways, asking them, in a kind of attention check way, repeat, tell us what this what this policy says about this particular thing. And we find that it matters. It does matter, but it perhaps isn't like the be all and end all of what's happening. But I can't really say much more conclusively until we run some more studies there. But here, so that was a little bit of a kind of vague description of and I think we're going to get a little bit more concrete as we go into study 2. So to Tyrone's, question, are the results of study 1 mostly driven by white participants and Asian participants seeing this description and saying, you know what, I understand that you've told me that this is going to benefit everyone, but it's probably only going to benefit underrepresented minority applicants. And so what we did is we focused on if we tell you exactly what kind of effect this policy is going to have on each group, how will you respond to that as a participant? And in addition to that, we addressed how much policy framing might be a part of what we're seeing. So in study one, we described this policy as a diversity policy, and to what extent is that driving participants' negative views of the policy? We had about 400 white M-Turkers, the same DV, and a whole mess of ideological measures, once again, adding in at this stage system justifying beliefs and procedural fairness as other possibilities. And crucially, we made some fairly big changes to the stimulus that we showed them, to the policy that participants read. In this 2x2 design, for framing, we either told them that it was a diversity leaders program, and it had basically the same wording as in the study we just saw. We're going to place greater consideration on the applicant's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, versus in the other condition, they were told that this is a promising leaders program. All of the diversity rationale was taken away, right? And instead, we're placing greater consideration on applicants' commitment to bold leadership and greater attention to applicants' passion for leading teams and organizations. The type of language you see a lot in a business school. For this other factor, relative benefit, we gave them exact numbers of how we expected the policy to affect each group. And in particular, I'll blow this up for us. We told them we're not only enrolling 50 additional students, but we're expecting this amount of underrepresented minorities and this amount of non-URM students as a function of this policy. So in one condition, we told them that there was going to be greater benefit to URM students, specifically that about 35 of the 50 slots would be expected to go to URM applicants, and about 15 would be expected to go to non-URM applicants. We both wrote this out in what they read, and we provided this figure for them to make very clear, very salient, not only the numbers, but the changes across years and the ultimate class size and demographic breakdown. In the other condition, we told them the exact same numbers, but we swapped who was benefiting more. And we told them that 35 of those slots would be going to non-URM applicants, 15 will be going to URM applicants. And so when we ask participants, how is this going to affect white applicants' chances of getting accepted, find that regardless of who it benefits, if it was framed as a diversity policy, it's seen as harming white applicants' chances of getting accepted. It is also seen as harming white applicants' chances of getting accepted, even when we take away the diversity framing and instead have the leadership framing, if that policy has been described as benefiting URM students to a greater extent than non-URM students. And it was only when we had neither, the diversity rationale, so it was the leadership framing, and we told them your group is going to get more than URM students. That was the only condition in which we saw that our participants did not perceive these policies as harming their likelihood of being accepted. We also, it's worth noting that they say that there's not going to be any effect. I'm not going to make too much hay of this kind of null here because we'll see a slightly different pattern as we go on to other studies. So there's one question here of how is there qualitative data on how participants define diversity, equity, and inclusion? I don't think we asked specifically that question. And so I assume part of where this question is going, and it's a very valid direction is, are we seeing that participants in the diversity leaders condition are just, they have a different, they're inferring things about how these policies will affect majority group members above and beyond what we're telling them in the demographic breakdown that we provide. And that's totally possible. Actually, Lisa Leslie has a recent paper where she kind of describes diversity initiatives as generally kind of being perceived in that way. People make a lot of inferences about how diversity policies are going to affect the majority group beyond what is actually described. And we think that's a possibility for what's happening here as well. So what about those ideologies that we measured? Even when we account for them, we see the exact same pattern of effects I'm showing you here. So we're seeing that the intentions of this policy, right? Who this policy intends to benefit more, whether that's minority members or majority members, is what's driving people's perceptions. And so what we asked ourselves was, is this a focus on being better off than the outgroup? Or is it actually just a sensitivity to how much better off one is made by a policy? So to make this a little bit more concrete, if we go back to our stimuli from the last study, we have a confound between who's benefiting more and how much white applicants are expected to benefit in an absolute sense. So in this condition, non-UM students are getting less than minorities, but they're also getting only 15 additional slots. Whereas here in the other condition, they're getting 35, right? So it could be, it's possible that what participants are focused in on is this jump or this drop between conditions, as opposed to the relative difference between the groups. So in study 3, we tested this directly with another 2x2, looking at relative benefits versus absolute benefits of the policy. Once again, had perceived in-group outcome as our DV, a bunch of additional measures, including we added in group esteem in this study, just trying to do our best to see if we're missing any ideologies that might be explaining these effects that we're not capturing yet. This in-group esteem has been shown in some work by Lowry and Zweta on diversity perceptions. And in addition to like really truly give the best possible, chance to ideology as an explanatory factor in our studies, we doubled our sample size, right? And our question, and the way that we set up this study was very similar to what we had done in the previous study. We made one crucial change. We thought, people have very specific and polarized views of Berkeley Haas and Berkeley. There's a lot of stereotypes about Berkeley out there in the world. Let's choose a school that is seen as being equal status, equal rank, but has less of that kind of polarization, is seen as a more conservative school. So we picked Georgetown's business school for the focal university in this case.
Drew, quick question from Art. He's just asking, sorry, before you go on, I think he's probably referring to the past studies. Controlling for the additional measures has made little difference. He's wondering, is there any interaction with those measures, and have you even done those analyses?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that in the results for this study.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we'll get to that in just a second, Art. It's a question, fantastic question. It's one we got from our reviewers. We're hoping to resubmit our paper tonight. And part of what
to JPSP, I will note.
Yes, to JPSP. Derek is the first author on this JPSP. And yes, but this was one of the main things that we were thinking about and we were running our analyses on. So we'll talk about that in a second. So our manipulation looked like this. Thanks, Art, for your well wishes. In order to isolate the effects of benefit, right, we took away all diversity framing in this study. So we're only talking about a leadership initiative there's no diversity rationale whatsoever in any condition in the study. And for this 2x2, we broke it down in this basic way. When in our high absolute benefit condition, we once again told participants we're increasing the class size by 50, and we manipulated relative benefits in pretty much the exact same way that we saw before, but we tweaked the numbers a little bit. So either 40 of those 50 slots were expected to go to URM students, or 40 of those 50 slots were expected to go to non-URM students. For the low absolute benefit condition, we made the class size increase just 1/5 of what it was in the other condition. So just 10 slots being added to the class size, but the proportion of those additional slots, what the distribution of them was exactly the same. So either 8 were expected to go to URM students, or 8 were expected to go to non-URM students. And so when we asked our white applicants, or white participants, how will this affect white applicants' chances of getting accepted to Georgetown, regardless of the absolute benefit, participants once again saw policies that provided greater benefit to URM students as harming white applicants' chances. And in contrast, they accurately, when it was framed instead as providing greater relative benefit to non-URM students, participants finally accurately acknowledged that this would in fact increase white applicants' chances of getting into the school. The main effect of absolute benefit was not significant. The interaction was also not significant. So all we're seeing here is this main effect of who this policy is expected or intends to benefit more, right? If it is intended to benefit minorities more, it's seen as a harm to white applicants. And if it is intended to benefit majority members more, it's acknowledged as benefiting their likelihood of being accepted. And so this is also, just because we have this one main effect, it becomes a very easy place to test Art's question. How not only can we look at whether or not ideology mediates these effects, but we can look at whether or not it moderates. And what we find is that by and large, the ideologies do neither, right? So we find no evidence whatsoever that this difference is mediated by shifts in ideology. And we find no consistent evidence across studies that ideologies actually moderate these effects. So in effect, what we're seeing, this is a really, really important point, right? And it's one that I'm glad that Art brought up, because what we're basically finding is that both people who are anti-egalitarian and just generally really dislike diversity and outgroups and really like hierarchy between groups, they show this effect, but so do our most egalitarian participants, right? And it becomes especially, I think, remarkable to us when we consider this bar and this bar. Because what we're seeing is that when white participants expect their group to get 8 more slots and minorities to only get 2, they see this policy as helping them, right? They accurately acknowledge, yeah, this is going to help our odds of getting accepted. But if you actually give them more slots overall in an absolute sense, but fewer than minorities, they all of a sudden see this as something that's harming their in-group, right? And that's both for egalitarian participants and anti-egalitarian participants.
True.
Yeah.
There's a couple of, or it looks like there's one. So Jason Konfua has a question. Jason, would you like me to elevate you and you can ask your own question, because you did not specify that you'd like me to. Jason, I've just allowed you to talk. Please ask your question.
Oh, yeah. Sorry for not clarifying. You could have asked. Awesome work, Derek and Drew. I'll make this really quick, just pertinent to this slide. Within these MTurk samples, was there a lot of variance on how they scored on these ideology scales? Like, were they on both sides of the ideology spectrums and whatnot?
Yeah. So I wouldn't be able to give you any hard and fast numbers. What I will say is that by and large, these were pretty egalitarian samples, right? So they were generally lower on the end of like, modern racism and SDO and so forth. Throughout, in every single one of our studies, the majority of our participants identified as politically liberal, right? So it's definitely not the case that, if anything, we're seeing more egalitarian people than you would expect in the normal population.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. And Gold has a question here. Is it possible that when participants see the graphs of future URM and non-URM students, they are interpreting the policy to have a URM quota, right? No need to elevate me. Yeah, let's leave Gold alone. I think it is possible that that's the case. And at the same time, if that were the case, we still wouldn't expect that if we explicitly told them we're creating a quota system, where participants should still report that the likelihood of a white applicant getting in is increasing, right? Because in effect, there's also a quota for the number of white students, the number of non-URM students. So I think it's very possible that they're making that inference, but it shouldn't matter for how they respond to our DV. And do we see any gender effects? I actually don't think we have. If we looked at gender effects, it was a long time ago, and I wouldn't be able to tell you what the results were, but we should do that. Okay, so we tried, I cannot impress upon you guys enough how earnestly we tried to get an effect with ideology and just couldn't. And so what we decided to do is let's test whether or not a majority group membership, perceiving these policies through a majority group lens or an advantage group lens, as Art has mentioned, might be what's causing these effects. So very simply, the easiest way to do this is to collect data from participants of different races, right? That's just what we did. We collected about 200 white participants and about 200 Black participants. We asked both, what is the effect going to be on majority group members, right? So on white applicants. And we dropped our ideological measures at this point. We showed them Berkeley policy, once again, the exact same design that we saw in study 2, with 50 extra slots, 35 going to one group and 15 going to the other. Once again, only use the promising leaders framing, no diversity rationale here whatsoever. And what we find is when we ask white participants, we see the exact same pattern of effects we've been seeing. When it is described as a policy providing greater URM benefit, they see it as harming white applicants' chances of getting accepted. When it's described as providing greater non-URM benefit, they see white participants see it as accurately perceive this as increasing white applicants' odds of getting in. Black participants also see a policy that's providing greater non-URM benefit as increasing white applicants' chances of getting into the school. But interestingly, they also accurately perceive even policies that help minorities more than majority members as increasing white applicants' chances of getting in, right? So this isn't just the case that everyone is making having this misperception about how these policies affect the majority group. It seems specific to majority group members. And we can go a step further, right? We can say it's possible here that along with belonging to white participants belong to the majority group and Black participants belong to the minority group here, there is kind of a historical nature to the context that we're studying, and going through the world as a Black person might train you to be more attentive to certain things. And so it might have more to do with the learned experience of being a minority member, or even more specifically, a Black person in America that would make you answer in this way. Or it could be that group membership itself leads us to attend to certain information differently than if we're a minority member. And so that's what we manipulated directly in this study. A simple two-cell design, once again asking perceived majority group outcome. This time, only white participants in our sample. And what we told them is we either showed them the exact same materials that we just showed you in the last study, a policy being rolled out at Berkeley, or we told them, once again, no diversity rationale, only the promising leaders framing. Or we told them this policy is being rolled out at Howard, a historically Black university, and we explained in this policy, we mentioned in this description that it is a majority Black institution. And so what we've basically done here is we've manipulated whether or not our white participants identify with the majority group in the Haas condition and Berkeley condition, or if they identify with the minority group in the Howard condition. Otherwise, these bars looked exactly the same across conditions, with the majority or the minority group always getting 35 of those 50 additional slots, right? The only difference being the minority group is URMs at Berkeley, white students at Howard. When asked about how this would affect white applicants or the majority group's chances of getting accepted when this policy is rolled out at Berkeley, and the majority group is white students, we find that our white participants once again misperceive this as not benefiting their racial group at all. But when we ask them about how this policy will affect the majority group at Howard, so how it will affect Black students, they accurately perceive that this policy will indeed increase acceptance rates for Black students. And so we're effectively saying that these participants are able to accurately perceive the benefits of these win-win diversity policies, but only when they are identified with the minority group. And so across these studies, what we basically find, in summary, is that majority members perceive diversity policies as unbeneficial to their in-group. And this holds true even when we account for ideological beliefs, even when we have gone to great lengths to create non-zero-sum win-win outcomes for all groups involved. And that these misperceptions seem to be driven more by who this policy intends to help, right? And less by the absolute size of that benefit. And in effect, we end our paper this way, and it's a little bit of a downer to end on, but it seems pertinent, is that it might be the case that policies that intend to increase diversity within an institution will only be deemed beneficial when they're actually designed to fail at their goal, right? And that has implications for what we should be aiming for when we design diversity policies, the possibilities for avoiding backlash or the inevitability of backlash, perhaps, and it should be perhaps something that we consider when we're working as practitioners or providing advice to practitioners in the diversity areas. So yeah, I went a little bit long, but thank you for listening. And once again, Isaac and Derek have done fantastic work on this project.
Great, thank you, Drew. Are there any sort of big questions, thoughts, future direction ideas for interventions for them? Art says really impressive research. What do you guys, so while people are thinking about their big questions, Derek, what are you guys thinking about with regard to, what might actually not prime this zero-sum mentality, whatever psychological process is happening to prevent these people from doing math properly, what sorts of ideas have you guys been kind of throwing around to get the benefit without the cost, essentially?
It's been an open question. We were really trying, as you can see in the studies, we were really trying to understand whether ideology would drive some of this, but it seems like it's this automatic tendency. With the work that we have with Isaac, we are kind of broadening it out and trying to understand that this is generally how people perceive equality. So if we include or try to promote equality enhancing policies that can bring the disadvantaged groups up without harming the advantaged groups, we're finding that even when thinking about equality broadly, people are thinking about this, especially people in the advantaged group, in a zero-sum way, that in order to enhance equality, you have to take away from the advantaged group, even though that's not necessarily the case. If it's not an ideological explanation, we are going to try to explore kind of like these cognitive tendencies. There's some work in subjective socioeconomic status by Keith Payne that suggests that people have a general cognitive tendency to see the world this way. So we're going to test out some of those possibilities.
Those sound like good paths forward. There's, one sort of thought that comes to my mind is, Drew, you started out the talk talking a little bit about how you and Derek spend an entire semester training, MBA students to understand that negotiation isn't a zero-sum context. I'm thinking, I wonder if you could test MBAs before and after they take your class, right? Like after they've stopped seeing the world in this zero-sum way. Okay, so we have a few questions. So Jason Akanafua asks, only if there's no student questions, which I don't see any. Do you think this effect is specific to business schools, or broadly, do you think maybe nursing schools or teaching colleges, places without a focus on business, economics, or money? Kind of maybe thinking about the fact that maybe they're in this priming mindset of zero-summiness. I'm reading into his question, but what about, have you thought about the kind of generalizability of the finding to other contexts? I mean, I know you did the, the HBCU study, but other ideas?
Yeah, Derek. I mean, this is part of what we've actually been doing with our follow-up work. So I mean, Derek can speak to this.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible. Like certain industries and of course certain departments have certain stereotypes, and business schools may be seen as a community predominantly held consisting of white men. So if we did change it to another department or type of school, that those stereotypes and perceptions might change along with it. But to suggest, and to kind of piggyback off of what Drew said, as we're broadening it out to this equality work, we've been looking at policies and looking at very different ones, eliciting different groups. So we've been looking at how people perceive white, not just white and Black, but white and Latinx, men and women, disabled versus non-disabled, people with a criminal history versus people that don't. We find this effect consistently across all of these contexts. And when we are just kind of broadly doing it with promoting this disadvantage versus advantage mindset.
Yeah, and this is what Derek was describing. That in addition to the differences in identities, we're actually looking at different contexts, right? So like not only school admissions, but venture capitalist funding, or hiring, or salary, and so forth. So yeah, it does seem to be generalizable.
And so Jason says, awesome. You might think of it as contexts that are stereotyped as competitive versus cooperative. Cool work, y'all. So I want to jump to, so Art, you asked a couple questions. So I'm going to go to Don Moore, who hasn't asked the question. Rachel Hebert also asked one. Rachel, I'll get to you next. So Don asked, have you considered using objective response scales rather than Likert type scales, like measuring estimates of the number of students helped rather than responses on a subjective scale whose normative accuracy is hard to assess? I think you briefly mentioned something about that. Maybe you want to expand on that a little, Derek or Drew?
Yeah. Well, I think I'll go ahead. Yeah. It's a very on brand question from my colleague Don, who does really fantastic work looking at overconfidence and does a lot of has a lot of dependent variables that are very precise in how they measure overestimations or overconfidence. So for us, what we actually find when we do this, we have used those types of measures before. And as I alluded to earlier, we actually find consistent results, but messier results with it. And like the best way of summing it up is people are just really bad at numbers. And so they sometimes you'll see participants answering the question the wrong way. Sometimes you'll see, but the people who are answering the question the right way, we still see them showing the effects that we'd expect. We also find like extremely, like really large variance, people putting in numbers that are just like really big or really small. And sometimes, yeah, I mean, like basically people, the kind of two categories are, they don't know how to answer the question the right way, even when it's very simple, or they don't know how to like think about numbers in a way that makes sense, or that you would hope they'd be able to do. And so we've kind of defaulted to using this, the measure that we showed you, because it's the one that kind of makes the most intuitive sense to the participants and ends up working best in a lot of different ways. One of them being reliability and kind of, cross study consistency.
Wonderful. So Don says, thank you. So I elevated Rachel. So Rachel Havard is one of our former doctoral students from the Haas Business School. So I wanted, we miss you, Rachel. So I elevated you. Please ask your own questions so that we may hear your voice, perhaps see your face. We all miss you.
Hey guys,
Hey.
Thanks for letting me lurk. I was wondering if you've thought about this from a challenge threat framework at all. It seems to me like these people are feeling really threatened, even though technically they aren't. But in some ways, their majority status would be diminished, right? Even though absolutely they'd be gaining the opportunity to enter these programs, relatively, they would then have a smaller majority.
Yeah. I think that was initially part of our thought. I think when we first started these studies, if we had to put our money on anything, we would have put it on group status threat.
Yeah.
And we asked threat in a lot of different ways and found that our manipulations weren't shifting status threat, right? They weren't shifting symbolic threat. They weren't shifting prototypicality threats, right? And the takeaway there seems to be that while all those things were correlated with how positively or negatively people viewed these policies, it wasn't what was explaining our results, right? And one of the distinctions that we've been making kind of theoretically is that some of the more group process level work or literature from that's like, classic that we were citing talks about threat in kind of the way that you're talking about it. But I think that there's a conflation between this idea of ideology, right? So like I formulated a worldview around this idea that I feel threatened or that this thing is a threat to my status, and just perceiving something as such, right? And then while having perhaps even a much more egalitarian view of the world. And that latter version seems to better fit the data that we have, right? It seems to be that people are really attuned to their group being knocked down a peg. And again, not in an absolute sense, but more just their relative advantage to the outgroup, to the minority group, to the disadvantaged group. But that's separate from whether or not they will even voice threat concerns. And I think that's a pretty profound distinction.
Subconscious. Like they don't even know that that's what's happening.
Yeah. I mean, and perhaps, I mean, I don't think we can go so far as to talk conclusively about how automatic this process is or how aware people are of it. They're aware enough to self-report that they think this is going to harm. Whether or not they see that as an ideal, like a basis for their ideological views, seems not to be the case.
Thanks for answering. Super cool work. Excited to
Thanks,
see where it
Rachel.
goes.
Lovely to see you, Rachel. So I'm going to jump back up to Art. He says, how does seeing it as beneficial to or not to their group related to being in favor of the policy? I would think ideology would drive some of that.
Yeah, it is.
I don't totally understand the question. Art, maybe I can elevate you to, you could ask, there's a couple of, sorry to out you, but there's a couple of typos in the in the thing, and I'm not really sure what you're trying to say. So please ask your question, Art. Maybe you can elaborate a little so it's easy to understand.
Here we are. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good. So no, it's just that there are people who say, yes, this will disadvantage my group, but it's worth doing it because it's the right thing.
Yeah, Derek. I mean, we were
a lot of us are those kinds of people.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We were actually talking about this very recently, but Derek can probably best answer this question.
I probably can't, but piggyback off of me too. But yeah, we've been thinking about this from one of the earliest times we were presenting it. Michael Rosenblum asked us this question. It's like, it will hurt me, but it's worth it overall. And so then we would expect it to probably come up in political orientation, particularly either. So we measure it 3 different ways, but even if not overall in social political orientation. And we find that it's not explaining our effect.
Well, I wouldn't think it would explain the effect, but if you were to also ask how much are you in favor of it versus how much do you think it harms your group, you might get a very different response.
That's true. We do have evidence. I mean, we did ask how much do you favor the policy? How much do you support the policy? Kind of wrapping in Jason's question. And I don't off the top of my head know the evidence for that across all the studies. But there probably is some variability there where people are saying that it will harm me, but I support it.
Yeah, we were seeing, a subset of people. It was not a majority of people who were saying, I think this is going to harm my group, but I have positive views overall about diversity policies, right? And one of the ideological measures we actually do include is a general ideological support for diversity, right? And has questions along the lines of, I think this is, this does more harm than good. That's a reversed, reverse scored item. But yeah, so there is a subset, and it's I think in one of the places we were looking, there's like kind of maybe like 35% of people who are saying, I think it's going to hurt, but I'm for it. Interestingly, this has kind of complicated implications for what it means for support, right? So one thing that we ended up doing this last election cycle is we actually collected we collected data from voters in California, and we asked them about Prop 16, right? And we had all of these, we had a bunch of ideological measures, not all the ones we have here, but still a number like SDO and system justifying beliefs and how favorably they viewed minorities, their political orientation, of course. And we found that even accounting for all of those, how much they saw it hurting affecting their group, that ended up the most strong predictor of how they were going to vote, right? We actually included as well, how do you think it's going to affect minority members? And that was strongly predictive as well. But when you put both of those in the model at the same time, they're both predictive, right? So it's not the case that people are just focused on whether or not this is going to have some benefit for less advantaged people. And it does seem that the inferences they're making about how these things are going to affect their group are translating in a very real way to whether or not they vote for these policies.
For future work.
Jason, do you want to pull? Sorry, you were starting to talk. Jason had I think roughly similar question. Why don't you join the conversation? Sorry.
Yeah, just as you all were answering, I was thinking about the question that Gold asked earlier, and just as a suggestion, by no means do I think you should change your manuscript. You also get that this work published, but for future work, it could be interesting to look at the gender component because what does URM mean and what does it mean in a business school? It could mean something much more salient about gender than it does about race. But then also, if that's the case, and people are imagining this is going to harm or benefit white men, it could be less about political ideology and more about, in these days and times, it is very salient that women are not paid as much as men, women are not given those leadership roles as much as men, and that above everything else, that needs to change regardless of the costs.
Yeah. And I was running some code. I was texting Gold on the side, but we don't find a gender effect across any of our studies. But that is really, really interesting. And maybe, Drew, we should put that in the paper at some point. But yeah, the point that you bring up, Jason, is really, really interesting, because there's a lot going in there, especially in a business school context, that could reasonably place women, and then they could identify with this underrepresented minority category.
Cool work, Gail.
Yeah.
Yes, I've heard lots of comments about cool work. Good luck on your R&R. I have one quick question that has to do with culture. So I know that you had a lot of Asian American participants in your sample that you did at Berkeley. I can't help but think about mask wearing in some countries and how it's not to protect the self behavior, it's actually to protect others behavior. So I'm wondering, if I'm a person that's from China or South Korea and I was raised to be very group oriented or other oriented, I wonder, do you have place of birth information in your sample? And I wonder if those people show a slightly more greater good effect.
Yeah. So this is another thing we were thinking about a little bit, and we don't have any hard answers for you. We asked we only collected data from American participants, so there's probably fewer foreign-born people than if we had just not had that restriction. But it is very possible that there are things that are specific to American dynamics, right, or American culture, or just a lot of this is one version of racial dynamics in America that is probably more that people are more generally fluent in than a lot of others, right? People have seen headlines about affirmative action at Harvard and Yale. They have ideas about whether or not race should be taken into consideration in the at UT Austin or something like that. And so it might be the case that in an entirely different context, let alone a different culture, you're going to see different effects. And I mean, that's basically an open question that we put in our manuscript, right? But looking cross-culturally is something that's definitely necessary. I would guess culture would matter. I would also guess that to the extent that this is about participants not being very good at making inferences about how these things affect their group, some of the effects might be the same.